Recording, take two. Okay, there we go. Audio only, that's fine. Alright, let's party. So, topic Abrahamic Faith. Pretty broad. So, you had some notes. I'll let you kick it off if you want to. Whatever you
Yeah,
had, whatever you were thinking.
yeah. Abrahamic faith. So, something kind of interesting about the Abrahamic faith. Abraham is considered like the forefather or whatever,
Right.
the first progenitor of not only the Hebrew faith, the Judaism, but also Islamic as well. I don't
hmm
know if you knew that.
Yeah, all three, yeah.
Um, right, and due to some of his sons that he had, and even the amount of sons that he had is in controversy. But um,
Father
Ishmael,
Abraham had many sons, and many sons had father.
is that a song that you
Yeah,
know?
yeah. It's a little bit of context going into it. Like I grew up Southern Baptist, so yeah, like all the propaganda was right there. So yeah, there was
How
this
many
song.
sons did they say,
It
if you
was the
remember?
song was Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. So something, let's just praise the Lord or some shit like that. But
Interesting.
yeah, yeah. So
So
like
speaking of like son in the context of a London or something.
yeah, it was vague, but I know, like you were saying though, getting into what is it like Ishmael, and there's like two sons, and it's like I know the Islam, like Sunnis and Shias, like don't they fight over like the which son or something like that?
Yeah, and honestly, I'm not entirely sure on that topic of that, but like the the idea is that he had two sons, but like multiple times in the Bible, it cites Isaac or Israel as being like his only son, his true son, which doesn't entirely make sense. But Ishmael's like the other one is like a prophet in the Islamic faith, and I'm sure that there's some controversy between that with some of the Shia and Sunni because they pretty much argue about pretty much anything that they can.
Yeah, yeah.
um, but yeah, what I was gonna say, I mean, um, you see like a big split there, and um, I suppose it's interesting. You can look at like the Old Testament God as the cruel one, and the New Testament God as like the forgiving one, or like
hmm
sort of like the difference of that. And one of the big turning points, obviously, being Abraham. Abraham's like a pretty big story, and you can talk all day about how it could be like a metaphor, an analogy, or something else, that a story that never took place. But um, an interesting fact I heard about the Abraham and Isaac story was pretty much most of the religions up until that time, or even cultures up until that time, engaged in like a human sacrifice.
Yeah.
And that was the test of Abraham, was like, the God's gonna ask you to do human sacrifice, and if you do it, you know, we'll end up switching it out for an animal. And then for like years to come, the Hebrews sacrificed animals at the altar and at the temple and all that sorts of stuff as like
Yeah.
um, offerings and whatnot. What is what are your opinions, at least, about the whole animal sacrifice thing, especially with your views on like Judaism and Jews? Do you think that's like worse, on par, or like better than you know some sort of sacrifice? Because this idea of sacrifice in general kind of seems barbaric, I guess, in a way, or pointless and useless, especially if like a large portion of the culture or society is like doesn't believe in religion. Well, then you're just literally wasting food, right? You're burning it.
Yeah, it's yeah. There's definitely some angles. So yeah, number one, you think of like sacrifice with like pagans and stuff, but yeah, of course, like they were doing it too. Everybody was doing it, and I think on one level, it makes sense. Like on a religious level, like they truly believe that it. And who's to say that it doesn't affect how things turn out? That you're showing sacrifice, and it seems like a kind of like you said, it seems like a waste. But to them, it's like if this gives me some kind of favor in the afterlife or here and now, then go for it. And there's a lot of like occult rituals that involve that same kind of thing. And so, it's almost hard to say like it's like this whole discussion of like does it actually do anything? The assumption's kind of like well no. Um,
There's
it it's
there's even
tough.
like the brief angle I was just gonna say on top of like it being a waste is there has to be punishment, and it's better than like giving it to like a state. sort of thing. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, oh, we're gonna punish you, but your punishment is giving your chickens and horses to the state. It's like, well, if you punish them by just burning it, then like they don't have that sort of remorseful,
So is
hey,
that
well,
is
you
that
took
the
my chickens and
is that the
whatnot.
context under which they typically sacrifice? Was it always like to redeem themselves of their sins or of a particular crime, or was it just like a to me it seems like it's just a ritual thing. Like yeah, we sacrifice a goat like once a month or once a year. It's just something we do regardless of how good or bad we were.
Well, that's one of the big differences between Judaism and Christianity, at least. So, like nowadays, since the temple got destroyed,
Mm-hmm.
the temple in Israel got destroyed, and then I think rebuilt, and then destroyed one more time. Ever since the temple got destroyed, the practice of sacrificing,
Mm-hmm.
like, was pretty much negated in like Jewish culture. They were
Mm-hmm.
like, well, it's impossible now, so we're changing the rules up, and you no longer have to do this. But that was, like I said, the big difference between Judaism and Christianity was that when you sin in Judaism, you have either monetary repayment, where you have to pay the person back money, or you pay them back, sheep or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
an equal sum of some sort of item, or and then you sacrifice as well, or have to sacrifice, um, for a multitude of reasons. It could be like a repayment forgiveness thing. It could be, in hope of something else. I'm not entirely sure what all of the reasons could have been. I'm sure there was a lot, because I'm sure they were sacrificing all day.
Yeah.
But so, and then in Christianity, when they sort of changed it, it was, ask for
Yeah, that's
forgiveness.
what I was gonna say.
You
Like
didn't have to
Jesus,
do
yeah,
much.
Jesus just hey, Jesus died for our sins. Like we're good. And that may explain why it appealed to so many people because it was like, yeah, you're covered.
We'll
Jesus.
say 20 Hail Marys and whatever else, and like, and then you can go and
Yeah, I think that
Jesus
appealed
will
to a lot
forgive
of
you.
them. Like you look at like some of the like the Christian, you could call them Christian kings in like the medieval times, Middle Ages and whatever. And a lot of them were like there were times where they like paid off the church or like they passed this decree like you
Yeah,
could just pay so it's almost like full circle. But yeah, it's
and
it's
that
interesting.
was the original controversy with like the the original Martin Luther King. The original Martin Luther King in like the early centuries. Have you had heard about him? You had known a little bit.
Oh yeah, yeah, Martin Luther, yeah.
He was like the sort of almost like journalist, or I think he was somewhat religious, but he had a big issue with how the church literally changed their laws to allow people to pay
Yeah, that's what he was fighting, yeah, in
their,
particular, yeah.
yeah, like sins or
Yeah, it's
sins
like, come
off.
on, guys, this is pretty fucking.
And
Yeah,
it's one of the
it's crazy.
reasons, I was just going to briefly say, it's one of the reasons why when you ask me like, do I identify as Jewish, well, when I look at all the other religions, and I think it's important to be like spiritual, not entirely religious but spiritual, and those things are very close together. I think Judaism is the most sensible. It honestly is the most sensible. When you look at the laws and practices that they ask of people, it works. All the stuff works, and the reason it works is because it's somewhat fair, or at least it's, everyone's held to the same standard, and there's just well-rounded punishments. I mean, granted, they're hundreds and thousands of years old, but also, like I had mentioned, there's books where it's hundreds of thousands of years of rabbis like reinterpreting the texts and trying to develop it. So it just seems like the most well thought out, most well-rounded, and a lot of the other religions after it, or at least especially Christianity and Catholicism, are just there to be like part of the power structure. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah, they definitely get corrupted. One thing that emerges to me about because once again it seemed very bizarre to me that like you would find someone who was like religiously Jewish but not ethnically Jewish at all. I've always put the things together, and maybe that's a whole other discussion. But I was just gonna say, yeah, like looking at the practical Judaism, like what kind of value it brings if you just look at it, how it's actually taught, its history and yada yada yada. And I'll look at this like zoom out a little bit at like what the purpose of religion is because obviously you have like actual laws like from very
Yeah.
early on you had like actual laws that were enforced by a king or whatever that's like oh you stole someone's something so therefore you pay this like it's whatever. But then there's like this layer of moral law where it's like well you're not going to go to jail or this but it's like everybody expects you to do right right versus wrong like in a softer sense. I think that's a big place where religion has always come into play, and what's interesting about it. And so, just to say briefly, I think that there is a need for that. There is, a lot of people are kind of like atheists and they're like, oh, Christianity and religion is just totally stupid, and they think that all it does is just provide answer to these big questions about like where do you come from, where do you go after, and but it's important. It's important to our evolution.
Yeah, and like society is incredibly complex. It's one of the things that like the nowadays leftists or liberals like
Hmm.
completely disregard on how complex society is and how complex like human relationships
Yeah,
are.
people desperately
Like
want to simplify it. Yeah,
the relationship one neighbor can have to another, or just one and in neighbor in almost any context, whether you're living in an apartment or literally a hut in the forest, like the relationship you can have is it can be so complex, like incredibly complex, unlike any other
complexity.
animal in the animal kingdom, because they still like ultimately rely on their instincts or their programming. But it seems people, even though they have a programming and all that sorts of stuff, they're just subject to such irrational sort of behavior. So, uh, once again, like you were saying, I mean, religion is it's so core to I've mentioned Jordan Peterson before, but so many psychologists talk about it. Him just a lot more recently about how there's like pillars of society. You have like religion. You have there's a reason that God's mentioned in the what is it, Pledge of
The
Allegiance, and
Constitution and everything. Yeah,
the Constitution and all those sorts of things, because whether you realize it or not, like there has to be some tying interests or beliefs, like systems. And I mentioned it before with like even a healthy marriage. Like I think it's important, at least when you're looking for like a partner, you don't have to talk about religious beliefs, but if
hmm
you do, it saves you like 40% of issues that could arise in the future
right.
if it's like already pinned down, whatnot. So
Yeah. Um, this kind of brings up like kind of a direction that I anticipated or that I wanted to potentially pivot, which is that if we assume that society or the individuals like benefit or almost need a type of like religion or a kind of spiritual guideline or moral guideline, so then the question is kind of like, well, either A, which one do you choose, or should we kind of try to make something new or make our own? Like, what do you think about that? Or like, what do you consider we talked about it a little bit, but like, what do you consider yourself religiously, or what direction do you think you're moving in? Do you? I guess that's the question.
right. It's super tough. I think I don't know. I'm not the bold enough person to like name it, put a name to it, and
Hmm.
write things down, and
Hmm.
all that sorts of stuff. And I think nowadays, like with just the idea of like words being created nowadays, like they are created so much, and they just don't really hold any weight. So, uh, on that front, I kind of just stick with Judaism. And when people ask, I say, well, it's complex because there's lots of sorts of sects of Judaism, and it's
Right.
existed for a long time across many different cultures. So it's practiced differently. And so, go into depth. But once
Hmm.
again, I've stressed the like important difference between like spirituality and religiousness is heavily spiritual. And in a way, I mean, I know it's like it's pretty ignorant of me, but at least I'm aware that it's ignorant. I like would go into depth about you know my beliefs of God and whatnot, and what type of form it takes, what that word means,
Mm.
because a lot of people, at least I think the majority of people, think about some sort of conscious entity that watches over, whether the galaxy, the universe, or the planet. I don't really know, whatever. And I think it works a little bit differently. And but as far as like the future moving forwards, I mean, people have talked about. There's a really interesting video. I looked for it before we chatted in my text with one of my friends who recommended it to me,
Yeah.
and you might know the name of it. It's like a long documentary almost on YouTube or BitChute, I'm sure.
Hmm.
Um, but it explains like the incredibly close ties some religious stories have with like stars and the way that stars move around. So even like Jesus and the days that he was born and the days that all these things happened could
Right.
just be like stories of astrological events.
Mm.
One of the most important like signs being like Pisces, like the age of Pisces when the you know symbol was in the area where the sun rises every single day, which happens, for like 100 and some years. It was in like the Pisces thing, and that's where you get the representation of the Jesus fish and why he's always associated with fish and all this sorts of stuff. But what's interesting is we recently are approaching the 2000 era, um, moved out of that year, and it would be assumed that some new, religious figure, like world figure, will ascend or like grow to popularity.
Hmm.
But the question is, what will that leader look like, and what will the religion be? And you have some people like Alex Jones, or some more like right leaning, dipping toes into the conspiratorial realm, saying that the new religion is going to be like a human, sort of centered, like human is God, we are God, and we are able to ascend, and we can gene modify and create clones and all that sorts of like pretty much give us the no or the ability or the conscious, what do you call it, the conscientiousness to like do
Hmm.
terrible things because it's in the name of like being gods. That's an interesting like little thought bubble. But you also have like a growing, what also seems like what I'm seeing is like a growing internet culture that I see on YouTube and on comments of um, like the most based political news reporters, or like the most central, where
Hmm.
people are like pretty into the, just being a kind person, and you know, trying to. I wouldn't say a lot of people believe in reincarnation, but like karma, like giving out, doing good and being good, being nice to animals, even though it's like, I think it's a healthy thing to hunt, but I don't think it's a bad thing to like say a prayer or say
Yeah.
something after you kill an animal, like
Yeah.
especially a large animal or something that, you know, it doesn't strike you as much as like an ant or something like that. I can, a reasonable guy, I'm not going to say that to everything, but like some of that stuff, I can definitely resonate with or like understand. And even people that are like not even religious or even pretty agnostic, or like just don't believe in God at all, are almost on that train as well. Even like morally or logically, they kind of follow that same path. Like
Yeah.
the more shit you put out, like the more shit you're gonna get back, because people are just gonna get pissed off more and more and more. You like see it with the media and just how it affects people. So that's my guesses, at least. You're heading in either a pretty bad direction.
Right.
Once again, I feel like it's like that light and dark dynamic, because all I see is like the worst situation and like the possible best situation. Um, but that's also not to say that these long-standing religions like Judaism and all these sorts of Hinduism and all that, that's not going to go away anytime soon, unless you're talking about a freaking massive war and shit. Like even then, you can't annihilate that. Like that idea is always going to exist.
Yeah. So I mean, things you're saying, it brought up a couple points for me, and I'm trying to see if maybe I can kind of put it all together under like one central point. Maybe not, but some of the ideas I had are so like the first thing I was thinking about is I guess you'd say this idea of standardization. Like when I ask you, like what is your like spiritual or religious beliefs, and you're like, well, almost everybody has something unique, it's like some unique take on it. But I guess I was thinking about like, well, what kind of like standardization do I see? Like, what kind of common themes do I see? And you kind of hit on that too. You said, well, everybody kind of is. Everybody has these ideas of like karma, like do good. Like people generally understand like being a good person, don't be an asshole. Like
Yeah,
pretty simple things that you don't need some like complex structure to have. Um, but then I think there are some things where we might need to get into that to more of that complexity, and I guess and one of the big ideas too is that, and one of the big functions of religion is that not everybody has the luxury or the ability to kind of get into the complexity, and most people just want it packaged for them. Like in the same way that like a farmer would farm and give someone food, it's like, well, you had a priest who could like go figure this, or a shaman who could go figure this stuff out for you. And so I just wonder,
Yeah.
like, what are the new priests and the shamans, and how are they guiding the people? It's like it's like kind of you said, there's like these different projections in the future. There's like different like neo ideologies and different divergences, and a lot of ways we're losing morality. There's definitely a lot of ways it could go for sure.
Yeah. I definitely agree. Like I'm so conflicted because like every time I listen to anything news related, it seems like it's going in the worst possible direction. But then,
Yeah,
every time I talk to someone, they seem reasonable,
that's
like a
the news
reasonable
for you. Yeah, the
person. Yeah.
fear-based propaganda and like the nihilism through that. Yeah, there's a lot to be
But
said for that.
even then, there's still like that. I have a fear that I have a double fear care that I take, that I don't want to be too ignorant. And even like Chris is saying, the world is moving really fast, and like you have to take action. He's all about taking action. And even you mentioned it, I believe.
Yeah,
So like, it's important to do something and not sit on the sidelines and just say, well, it doesn't seem like this is happening, so I'm not going to do anything.
right.
I suppose.
Yeah, and so there's actually we're starting to segue into some of the other points I wanted to get into. One, kind of like we just said, this idea of like taking action. I've had this theory of religion in general, and especially like Christianity, as being like a very like pacifying force. About how it gives a lot of people this kind of like, well, God's going to take care of it, so I don't have to. So it gives a lot of people kind of like a relief in that sense. Um, and yeah, so like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, relief of death, 100%. So like, someone had made a listen to a good thing. Once I'm not going to take credit for it, but I'll relate the information because I think it's impactful. It's like humans have for a very long time in the past had to worry about life day to day.
Hmm.
Not even day to day, but like hour to hour,
Hmm.
and before hours even existed, right? So like, you had to feed yourself a certain amount of times. You had to find shelter, all that sorts of stuff.
Right,
I don't
right,
have to go through it. You can imagine, right? And then one day they reached a point where they had enough food for their next day, and maybe for like an hour they got to relax before they went back out and did something else.
right.
Well, eventually humanity reached a point where their consciousness changed because they had
Mm.
a long time later, they had enough sustenance to last their entire life.
Yeah.
So what did they worry about then?
Mm.
That is when they started to finally question death
What's next?
and like
Yeah.
be scared of death. You don't really ever think about death when you're putting your life on the line every single day. I mean, we know this. This is like even the argument for like anarchy or whatever is like the strong will survive, survival of the fittest. You'll
Mm.
get like courageous people, brave people because they're willing to put their lives on the line, and they'll grow stronger and all that because of it. So when people started to then begin questioning death, people say that it's like the birth of religion and all those sorts of ideas. And you're 100% right. Like people had to somehow contend with this idea of death, and a lot of people even nowadays do it without knowing it. And it's a big thing that like Buddhists and those sorts of like self meditation, you know, journeys and practices will have you contend with is death. And people talking, that even has a whole segue into like psychedelics because people have like that ego death or that feeling, which they say is very freeing and very good. But a lot of people, especially the people that are not doing psychedelics because they
Hmm.
go to church every day and they,
They got Jesus.
don't do that. They have Jesus, and Jesus is their safe way, to like accept death. And what's really cool, or at least I find interesting, is like it's a very refined thought process because people live their whole lives and die smiling, saying, I'm ready to meet, Jesus, and their family at their funeral says, he went to a better place. So like it's a refined process. Everyone like it helps them, I suppose. So it just goes to show like, once again that leads us right back into like the pillars of society. I mean, if you shake that, you know, what it has untold,
Yeah. Yeah, we
consequences.
haven't
Like,
been there. We haven't been there yet, right?
well, we haven't been there, and like I said, the best case study for any sort of thing, because like it loops right back into what we were talking about with humans being so complex. Because humans are so complex, you just cannot run like simulations. You cannot predict the future. It's the
Yeah.
reason why the stock market like has the effects that it does, the only thing you can look to is the past. And the quicker we change from the past, the more unpredictable the
Mm.
outcomes are going to be. And right now, we're like changing so fast from the past. It's absolutely like it feels so weird. It feels so weird. And,
Yeah.
it's tearing the country apart and all that sorts of stuff.
So,
So you just have
um,
to acknowledge these things.
yeah, this is great. Like, there's so many. I'm trying to think. Once again, like I've kind of built up several different threads, and I look for ways to kind of combine these ideas together. But I guess I'll just kind of trudge through it. So, I mentioned talking about how Christianity like kind of pacifies people and makes them like gives them a sense of relief, and technically, what I was thinking about that, you mentioned a good point. Like, yes, death like gives them relief about from death, also gives them relief of like knowing where we came from, all this kind of stuff. What I was thinking about in particular, and what I see a lot is like for example, like Christians, like even my parents will look at these problems in the world, and I'm like, yeah, we got to do something, we got to do this, we got to do this. But for them, it's kind of like, oh, I think God's handling it, part of God's plan, and I think there's
Mm.
some validity to it. I think there's a lot to be said. You shouldn't stress yourself out and take too many red pills, but anyway, that's a potential weakness of it. We don't have to say too much more on that. But and then the next thing I was thinking was, you talked about how like in our ancient past, or not even ancient past, but you had people that were just hunter gatherers, day to day hunting. They didn't have much time to just sit and relax. And funny enough, a little aside on that is that they say that hunter gatherers had more time to relax and dance and to dance
Right.
and sing
That's
than
because work didn't exist for them. And
exactly.
it was just life.
There's a
It
lot
was
to be
just
said. A lot to be said for the agricultural revolution. But anyway, like, but in general, you're right. Like, and it
life.
made me think of like Maslow's hierarchy, which I think I've mentioned before. Are you familiar with Maslow's hierarchy?
You've mentioned it like once or twice before, and I remember searching up that picture. I'll have to
The little pyramid. You get the basic
study it a little
concept.
bit
Yeah,
more. But yeah, I do
it's
get
it's
the basic
good, and
concept indeed.
because it's exactly what you're talking about. This idea of like what you have to focus on the bottom of the pyramid first, and then once you build from there. And throughout the course of history and evolution, we got better and could climb higher. And I've also mentioned the eight circuit model before, which is very similar. They're both kind of like models of consciousness, and they kind of describe like the layers of the things that we think about, or the layers of the things that we process. And in the eight circuit model, like it specifically says like, oh, this circuit was not unlocked until like leisure class civilizations like first arose, and people had time to just kind of like you said, just be leisurely. And it's a very interesting little aside there. But
Hmm.
the next thing I was going to say was on talking about like Christians and how it gives them a sense of peace about death. Actually, it seems I've kind of found that like it almost seems like Christians are more neurotic than a lot of people about death, and maybe everybody gets neurotic about death, and uh, and maybe an aside on that is people like Terence McKenna often said that one of the goals of the psychedelic experience, or one of the goals of life in general, was to kind of like give ourselves a peace towards the other and prepare ourselves for the other and what comes next. So that's interesting. And
Well, a quick note on that is to
yeah.
say because, and the reason, like you mentioned, it's almost like they concern themselves with it too much is because there's not just one other, there's two others. There's a punishment as well, which at least
Ah,
you can,
yes, yeah.
yeah, at least you can. I don't want to say like award, but you can award the Christian and Catholicism for like having is that that's the main thing to fear. And what's interesting is people say you fear, God's wrath or God's punishment or fear God above all else, but mostly they act in a way that means they won't go to hell
Yeah,
because
yeah.
they're not fearing God, they're fearing,
Hell.
the
The
hell or
tangible
Satan or
consequences, yeah.
and what's outside of God. That I award them for that because, like I said, with their whole forgiveness, the way they operate around forgiveness being a little flawed, at least, they have that like overseer, that thing where someone's always watching you, someone's
Right, right,
always
yeah.
judging you and everything. So that's why it then that's where people go a little neurotic and whatnot. It's not always good. And like I said, that's the upside and downside, I guess, to everything, like you were saying.
Yeah, the heaven hell dynamic definitely very real. Definitely a lot to be said about that as far as like what really motivates Christians or what motivates people. Is it more the fear? Or is it more the love of heaven? And there's a lot to be said there. We can go into it at some point, but I kind of wanted to. So this is like one of the last things and one of the big things, and this might be the real food for thought here, which is you've mentioned at least a couple times this idea of complexity and of rising complexity. This idea of like I'm sure you've heard of like the idea of like singularity, or like the rate of evolution, or the rate of information, and the rate of complexity in human society is just getting exponential. And it seems like we're potentially approaching a precipice. And I think about this all the time, and I think about it recently, especially when I see like clown world dumb shit in the news. I'm like, man, we're really getting close to this event horizon. And this is something that, so again, you've heard me mention Terrence McKenna numerous times. I've actually even been reading back into him recently, and he talks about this a lot. He talks about this like rising complexity, but how it ties into what we're talking about is, so one of his big theories is, he calls it the transcendental object at the end of time. And the basic idea is that rather than evolution being this kind of like cause and effect thing, it's more of us getting pulled towards the future. It's almost like a predetermined type thing. Like everything that's happened, though it technically looks and kind of operates under an evolutionary like cause and effect, like infinite possibilities, but truly we're being pulled towards this kind of like destiny in a way. And
Hmm.
as a part of that, he talked about how maybe it's just the object itself, or maybe there's like a thing that he called the overmind, which he seemed to talk about. The overmind was like kind of like how a lot of people would consider God. It's kind of like an entity or some kind of force that looks over us and actually affects what we're doing. But to say it briefly, he one thing about the overmind that he said in regards to Christianity in the Dark Ages is that he said that what the overmind does is it, in this effort to balance us out and pull us towards our destiny, if one of the human faculties, or almost like, oh, you could almost say like the pillars, like you're saying, gets out of hand or gets unbalanced, it will introduce a person. You talked about how like what would the next person be, what would the next savior be, and
Hmm.
there's this idea that it unleashes this person or this idea on society to help balance. And so his theory was that like the Roman Empire was just getting like nutty with like conquering the world and technology and all this stuff. He's like, but like human morality was like lagging behind. So he talks about how like the overmind or history or the transcendental object, like, or evolution, introduced this introduced Christianity, however it did so, maybe through
Hmm.
Christ or through whatever, as a way to kind of like almost intentionally and introduce the Dark Ages or set us back so that we could kind of like catch up and process.
Hmm.
Very interesting stuff.
Right. So maybe a few different things to say on that, I suppose. To real quick, like directly address like your last point, or at least, pretty much Jesus. If that's what we're talking
Jesus.
about, Jesus, and like you can point to that. What's unfortunate is like, you can point to a lot of different things
Hmm.
as a lot of empires have been taken over with no savior. A lot of empires have grown quite strong with no savior. Now, the parallels between the Roman Empire and the US right now are strikingly similar,
Yeah.
right? Like incredibly strikingly similar. And even the paths that they're taking to like collapse are, you can draw quite a bit of parallels. So it's most definitely interesting to keep an eye on that. And maybe, who am I to determine, when the world is in true peril or when it's, in just minor peril or whatnot. Um, so maybe Jesus was that type of figure, but it's been what 2,000 years since any sort of prophet has come down. So now would be a really good time. You know what I'm saying, universe? It's like we're kind of overdue. So we better get someone now that at least can say like. Imagine though, a guy comes down, or a person's born, or I don't fucking know, Joe Rogan, who knows, maybe
Joe
Joe
Rogan.
Rogan's that
Yeah.
guy already,
Hell yeah.
who knows. They come out and they say, yeah, well, God says gay marriage ain't legal. Like, imagine like that's what they say. Like, people aren't just gonna take that. Even I'd I'd even say, even if this person's doing miracles and they're literally healing cancer, and they say gay marriage is a bad idea, I bet you people are still gonna have issues with it. Like, that's the insanity of the times we live in right
Yeah.
now. I mean, literally. So, um, but at the same time, to go even farther back to what you were talking about, just the idea of the, what'd you call it,
The object,
what'd
the
you,
transcendental
the
object.
object,
Yeah.
transcendent object, yeah. So have you ever heard of a guy named Nassim Haramein?
Hmm.
He's like a scientist that all of his work he kind of like relates to spirituality
Right.
in a way. And you can look up a little bit of like his YouTube, if you ever get the chance. But in a nutshell, some of the things that he worked on was Um, he found that, well, he didn't entirely find because it's science and a lot of it is like, hypotheses that are tested but not tested probably enough. So I'm not going to be the one to say it's all legitimate. But the ideas that he puts forward is that most of the energy and the energy complex that like runs the universe, at the smallest degree, what's called the Planck length, I
Hmm.
might have mentioned it before, is like the smallest measurement of the universe, where anything beyond that is almost just pure energy. And to tap into that would be to tap into, like, what people have called 0 point energy, or like
Oh,
the
hell yeah.
even Nikola Tesla called like the ether, is like this energy field that runs everything.
Mm.
um, and what's interesting about that is the energy that then is inside of it, the electrons or whatever it is, they have this sort of framework where it's like a fungus where it's one collective entity.
Wow.
And in a way you could almost picture that as God.
I
And
like
in a
that.
way you could picture that as a massive neural network. And
Yeah.
so the way that the galaxy runs is technically it's feeding information
Oh,
to
wow.
itself all the time. And so it's like, it's almost like, if you can imagine, humans are a creation of the universe so that the universe can experience itself,
Hell yeah.
because the universe has no way of actually experiencing its own self, just creating or analyzing itself.
Damn. I
and
like
and
that.
so in a way, people would say the universe is a simulation or some sort of, like, created thing, but maybe, it just created you in its existence. Like, how are you going to separate that neural network from like a computer system, or how are you going to separate that from like just literally a living entity? Like, does it have feelings? I mean, I don't know. But the idea also is that, with the whole Big Bang, and you might have mentioned before that you're not entirely a fan of it or like the idea, but if we follow along that like thought path,
Hmm.
which is an interesting thought path, the whole reason that we have the Big Bang theory is that we notice that things are moving away from each other.
Right, right,
Einstein realized that like everything's moving away, even the Earth is, moving in a certain direction, the sun is moving in a certain direction.
right.
And if you like rewound time, all of this stuff would
Back to a point, yeah.
come back to a certain point in time. um, well, so that means things are moving. And Nassim has mentioned in some of his things that, what you could almost picture is that if it does contract and expand and contract and expand like multiple times, it's evolving, it's growing. And the
Mm.
space that Earth travels forwards and backwards is kind of what you're talking about with evolution. Is like, it's like a process being played out. It's like there could be devolution, there could be
Mm.
evolution. It depends on which direction it's going. It
Yeah.
also depends on the path it's traveling. Like, the path could be knocked aside, and in doing so, certain species could go extinct, and in doing so, the universe would learn what that, features like, and how it would evolve and devolve and all that sorts of stuff. So I mean, it's mind-boggling to sort of think about, but in a way it like makes sense. So it's a fun thing to think about, or at least it's thought-provoking.
Oh, hell yeah.
And it seems it has a lot of things in tandem with the transcendent,
Yeah,
source and
yeah.
everything like that.
So it makes me think of a couple things in which I think. No, so number one, I'll say like I think I'll probably wrap up here. Just I think it'll be a shorter session today, but
Okay.
I think this is a great. This is setting up for a potential really good next topic, which maybe just under the blanket of physics or this like beyond physics, because you seem to be knowledgeable and it's stimulating to me. Like I love like what you said about like the Plancks and kind of the next level pure energy and how the whole universe can like basically relay information or across itself, regardless of light speed or anything. I think that's awesome.
Right.
That ties into a lot of stuff that McKenna talks about. I think he said Bell theorem or something like that is this idea of like non-locality. But no, I think that'd be a great place to pick up next time. I think that's awesome. Like you brought up so many awesome things like the Big Bang. Yeah, I even saw an article recently that talked about how like the actual physics or the laws of certain spaces has been shown to evolve. has been shown to
Yeah.
change. So I thought that was super interesting. So we could definitely, I think that'd be a good topic for next time. Let's talk about like physics and beyond is maybe what we'll call it, and we
Are
just
you are
start.
you are you in a rush to leave? Because there's like two small things I wrote
No, no,
down that
not
I'd
not a
like to
super
just
rush.
quickly mention.
It's just my wife just wanted to eat dinner in a little bit. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, kill it.
Okay, so two quick things. We talked briefly about like religion and Israelites. So did you know that there's a component when Moses got kicked out of Egypt and they had to create like a moving like temple in a way? They call it the tabernacle. They
Interesting.
did you know there's a component on it made of dolphin skin? It
What the
requires
hell?
dolphin skin.
Oh my
So
gosh.
there's very specific instructions on how to rebuild it, and people do rebuild it and like, to
Hmm.
just try it out. And one of the components is dolphin skin, and there's crazy other components. That means that there had to have been dolphin skin traded in Egypt at the time, which is possible, but that's pretty crazy. Another thing you had talked about was when people were, you said with religion, how like some people just want a framework to operate under. They don't really want to go into the deep things like we talk about.
Right.
They just kind of want to live their life under like an easy, framework given. Something that's like always to consider, and even if I've brought this up, it's like a great reminder if we are recording to anyone listening, that 15% of the human species of any population
Hmm.
you take has an IQ below what it takes to read instructions and then follow them properly. So there will always be a subset of people that no matter what rule set you think in your mind would work on the population, or whatever rule set you follow that you might think works,
Yeah.
will not work with people who literally cannot understand
Yeah.
it. And so it's like sometimes you need very basic things that don't make sense, or at least aren't fully explained, in order for people who can't fully think them through to understand. So that's pretty much it. Those are the only things.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Like, there's definitely some, I could see that topic kind of like flooding into or kind of transitioning into these ideas about like how would you implement this stuff, or how does this fit into government models, and or all this kind of stuff. But yeah, no,
Yeah,
that's fucking dope. Yeah,
exactly.
we'll keep it rocking for sure. We'll shoot for next week. Talk about physics and some fun shit, and go in that direction and go wild, and just keep it rocking, man.
It sounds fucking fantastic. Peace out, my man. Have
Hell
a good
yeah.
one.
We'll talk to you later, man. See
Talk to
ya.
you in a week.